Welcome back, I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review, where we have our specially trained AI design eye analyse an old competition piece of mine and give us some ideas about how it meets the principles and elements of design, which is how we are generally judged in competitions, and also gives me some suggestions for improving the design. This week we have a petite design, so limited to 23 centimetres in every direction, height, width and depth, and it was judged from the front and the sides. The title was Fragile Beauty, and I know when I did this, which was in 2018, so some considerable time ago, it was one of the very last petite designs that I attempted because they just don't speak to me. I know I've got some others who watch these videos who love petite designs and will do them over and above anything else that they might want to attempt, but for me it's just not a design style that I'm comfortable with. And the same with miniatures. So by this stage I had stopped doing miniatures altogether and I was winding back on doing the petite designs for that very reason. Simply just I just can't get the scale and the proportion right in my eyes. So this one, as I said, titled Fragile Beauty, what I've done is used a very small timber slice as the base, and onto that I've glued some sponge, some sea sponge, to give me a diagonal line, to give me the height, and that's what I found worked for me in terms of filling that space in the petite design, was to work on the diagonal rather than the vertical and the horizontal. And so I've put some bleached seaweed in the design as well, some bleached lichen, so I think it's probably reindeer moss in fact, and some bleached basilia as a little bit, that's the round parts in it. It was a stage where I was going through my bleached phase and I was trying out bleaching lots of different plant materials to see what sort of an effect I would get. So you'll see some other designs here. Seaweed was the most successful of my bleaching experiments, and so I continued to use that for quite some time and indeed had some great success internationally using it in competition pieces. The design placed second in the competition, and looking at it now, I think that there was probably not enough of the space used, and I think not enough of obvious plant material. Now, sponge is not a plant material, it is an animal, or produced by an animal, and so the idea of using that in the design was probably not the best decision I'd made, because it is quite dominant. Had it not been as dominant, then I would have got away with it a little bit more, I think. The second image there is just with my set of keys, so that you can get an idea of the actual size, the scale of the design. I think that I can see some things that are wrong with it in terms of the principles and elements of design, but I am interested to see not just what the analysis is, but also what the suggestions are for improving it, because this was an area where I really struggled. We never, in these competitions, got very much feedback at all. One sentence, it was always verbal, never written, and that stopped me from being able to develop a style within that a petite and miniature framework that might have helped me continue to do those designs. So it's one of the benefits of Floral Art Review, of using the website, of using the reviews that you can get for yourself, is that you can have that educational journey in private with your own designs and understand them and play with them in your own time, in your own space, as I say in some of the other videos. So let's go on and see what the analysis says about this particular design and what the suggestions are. Looking at form, first of all, the design features a strong, sweeping, asymmetrical form. The vertical finger-like extensions of the sea sponge reach upward and outward, beautifully anchored by the flat, solid form of the timber slice at the base. So it's balanced and the form is there in terms of the materials that have been used. I've kept them in that sort of circular shape, that circular form, both with the shape of the sponge being rounded even though it's elongated, and the other plant placements that are there. Texture. Texture is the absolute standout element here. That must have been the beginning of my texture phase. The designer has created a rich tactile experience by combining the porous, rough surface of the sponge, the crinkly, brittle nature of the dried lichen and leaf, the smooth grain of the wood base, and the soft, fuzzy spheres of the dried botanical accents. Looking at the texture there is some smoothness in terms of the base, but there's a lot of rough. And so I probably would have improved it. I'm going to have to stop in a minute and have some water because I'm going to cough. But I could have improved the design by having more obvious smooth elements within that textural contrast, even though there's a good contrast there. I'm back. Colour. The palette is highly cohesive, monochromatic progression of warm earth tones. This subtle colouring enhances the feeling of age, desiccation and fragility. And my thinking behind this particular design, which I forgot to say earlier, was about the fragile beauty of the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Queensland in Australia. And I wanted to depict that. I think it was probably newsworthy at the time in 2018 for whatever reason. And so I wanted to depict that fragile beauty that we were losing in terms of that place in the country. So I've kept it to those tones quite deliberately, and I think that colour is probably, in terms of that title, fragile beauty, colour would be something you would have to be very careful about, because the bolder the colour, the less fragile the overall feel is for a design, I would think, in looking at it. So it's certainly something to think about. Line. A dominant diagonal visual line is established by the primary upright material, guiding the viewer's eye from the dense cluster at the base through the negative space of the fingers. So from this angle you can't quite see it. From the sides it would have been more obvious that there was spaces between those upright parts of the sponge, and so that negative space between those sections was incorporated. There is a lot of space still around the design, and I don't think I have used the space as well as I could have, because that stand that it's on is the limit of the sizing, and even though the angle of the photograph indicates that I've gone above the height, I hadn't, but I haven't used the depth as well as I could have, and I haven't used, the width is okay, but once again you've got to be very careful about the proportions of your plant material, that the width, the height and the depth, so that it doesn't look like you just put a box inside of a box. So it's quite a challenging framework to use, because you are constrained by a cube. You need to think about how you're going to use and have that ratio of 3:5:8 in terms of using up the space in your design. So space now, the negative space between the vertical branches of the structural material is utilised perfectly, preventing the Petite design from feeling heavy or cluttered while adhering to the tight size constraints. So probably those two comments in with one another. It hasn't pinpointed at this point, maybe it will be in the improvements about using that overall space. And that was the thing that I often struggled with, not so much with the miniatures, because that was less than 10 centimetres, and so it was very definite sizing that you had to get right, and the container was always the issue with the miniatures. But in terms of this design, I haven't restricted my interpretation by having a container. Rather, I've used the base as the display platform, the timber slice. Proportion and scale. This is the most crucial principle for a petite class. The materials are excellently scaled to one another and to the overall 23 centimetre allowance. Nothing feels overwhelmingly large or disproportionately small. And that is because I have grouped things together. So you'll see that the Basilia is grouped together because individually they would probably look too small in relation to the sponge, which is quite a large feature, but the sponge is relatively close to the size of the timber slice, and because your eye travels through those two, neither of them look out of place. And through the centre I've got the lichen, which I probably could have grouped better. I think that's probably a failing in the design, and I'm a bit concerned about the dominance of that sponge now that I look at this image for a bit longer than normal. Balance. The piece achieves successful asymmetrical balance. The visual weight of the extending material on the right is effectively counterbalanced by the denser cluster of lichen and the solid mass of the wood slice on the lower left. So the balance is there, and I can see that the balance is there. I just would like it to be a little bit more continuous through the top third of the design, so I can see the basilia on both sides, and perhaps what I should have done is brought a couple of those little florets onto the front side of the sponges rather than have them all behind the sponge. Contrast. The design relies heavily on textural contrast to create interest, allowing the smooth wood to highlight the intricate, fragile details of the dried elements. There is contrast there, and we saw that there was contrast in the textures, and so there's no contrast in the colours. They're just in the single colour palette. So the contrast really comes through from the texture, doesn't come through from the form of the plant material, because they're all pretty much in that rounded form. So it's fortunate that the contrast, the textural contrast is there, because otherwise it would look somewhat flat. The dominance and focal area. The central cluster where the pale, delicate dried leaf sits nestled amongst the lichen, so that's the piece of seaweed, acts as a gentle focal point, drawing the eye in to appreciate the micro details of the fragile components. And so that's probably a good thing. It is a good thing in terms of the design itself, but it's allowing your eye to flow because of the shape, the form that dried seaweed takes. It takes you to both sides of the design, and it makes you look behind and down, and so the placements are right in that area. I just feel like I needed to have repetition of the lichen, particularly a little bit higher in the design as well. So let us see what the suggestions are from Design Eye for the design. So walking the design is the first one. Even within a small staging niche, such as was provided, judges will look closely at the profile and rear of a petite design. The transition where the upright structure meets the wood slice appears slightly abrupt from the front angle. Ensuring the lichen and base materials wrap entirely around the back and sides to create a flawless 360-degree finish will elevate the technical execution. And that's exactly right. I can see exactly what it means, as the lichen is all to one side. It's sort of, and from this angle, which would have been the main judging angle, even though it was judged from the sides as well, there is an abruptness to that join. It's a gap that doesn't need to be there. It's certainly not have the same density of the lichen as I've got on either side of the sponge, but have a little bit around the base so that it just looks like it's naturally occurred, being caught in the sponge, so to speak. So number 2 in our improvements is mechanics and placement. The small spherical dried accents, which is the basilia, placed on the wood slice at the front left, feel a bit disconnected from the main flow of the design. Integrating them more organically into the lichen or creating a stepping stone visual path that leads directly up into the main structure would unify the piece further. So this is what I was talking about, where I've got that little grouping of basilia right at the front of the design, but I haven't got, the next one is the step, sort of the middle of the design, and then at the top of the design. So there's no continuity with that particular placement. You don't need the same as with the lichen. You don't need the big bunches, but a couple here and there, just to give you that path through the design. That repeating that plant material through the design would help the design. And number 3 is the thematic enhancement. While the materials evoke fragility, the thick wooden base is quite heavy and solid. Tapering the base or using a thinner, more delicate slice of the timber or even elevating it slightly on concealed feet would make the entire composition feel lighter and more precarious, heavily reinforcing the fragile beauty theme. And I think that's right. I think that the timber slice, even though it's reasonably thin, is probably a little bit too solid for the lightness of the rest of the design. And so putting it on feet would help, but I think what would help would be to have it on a piece of there's a lacy seaweed that you can get, and perhaps having the timber base underneath so you could see through it and it would lift it up above the staging area itself, but having that sort of lacy base to the rest of the design would enhance it further. So definitely something that I would consider. So there we have our assessment analysis of Fragile Beauty, the Petite design. I hope that that's given you some insights into what you need to be thinking about in your own designs. Please take advantage of the service that is provided by Floral Art Review to help you in your education journey. It's fully private. No one else is going to see it. You can take your time to understand what the analysis is telling you about your design. You can play around with your designs. You can resubmit the designs, but it's the result, the report that you get is always there for you to refer back to. So it's an invaluable resource in terms of feedback about your designs as you progress on your floral art journey. I will leave you with that until next week. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review.